Well, welcome, Holy Roast friends and visitors near and far to this, our next episode of our podcast. We are so excited that you're here. Hope you've grabbed a cup of coffee. I forgot mine today, but that's okay. Our guest has one. Wonderful. The guest that's with us today is the Reverend Dr. Amanda Henderson. She's the director of the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Iliff Theological Seminary. And so we are just so grateful for you joining us today. Welcome to the Holy Roast Podcast.
Thanks so much. So glad to be here.
Joining us from Denver, Colorado, here to sunny Kentucky. And we're just so grateful for your time. For those that probably don't know you here on our platform, would you just take a moment to introduce yourself and say a little bit more about that really wonderful title that I just read and what you do there at Iliff?
Absolutely. I'm the life of the party because everywhere I go, I talk about religion and politics and talk about all the things you're not allowed to talk about. So I'm glad to be here to talk about those things. So I am ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and just completed my PhD with a focus on politics and religion and rhetoric and the ways that religion is embedded in political speech. Yeah. And I have I led the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado here for 7 years, doing political advocacy, bringing people together across different religious backgrounds to advocate for human rights and equality issues. And through that, I so often felt like there was such a shallow understanding of what religion is and how religion functions in our political sphere. And that led me to work to launch this Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Iliff School of Theology about 4 years ago. And our work includes research and education and content creation, all of in all the places where religion and politics collide with culture, which to me is pretty much everywhere. So we have no shortage of possibilities.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds incredible. Yeah, such important work. That's what, as you were talking, I thought, well, that's almost everywhere. That's in everything.
Yeah.
As a people and a culture and how we sort of interact with each other and the world around us. That sounds like really exciting work. So thank you. And I apologize. I introduced Iliff incorrectly. My assistant pastor is going to get me on that one. Yes, Iliff School of Theology. Please.
At least you said Iliff right. So most of the places I go, they cannot figure out how to say Iliff.
That's right, Iliff. Yeah, because my assistant pastor currently attends there, as in the MDiv program. I've at least learned that spelling. Don't ask me about that, but I can at least say it. Well, just with the season that we are in here, and another presidential election cycle. I know we're sort of in different social contexts here. Rob and I both serve in Louisville, a more urban setting, but it's, the whole state of Kentucky can still be a pretty diverse place in terms of how people engage and talk about sort of religiosity and politics. And so one topic, and I'll just own this, one topic that I've been saying I want to talk more about because it seems to be everywhere, and I think it's a major threat to how we preach the gospel today. And that's just the topic of Christian nationalism. And I know we're just going to kind of jump in the deep end. It's a heavy hitter.
No softball questions here.
No softball questions.
Perfect. That's my favorite.
But, it's really been weighing on my spirit the last 6 months, of just, I'm feeling this need to talk about it or to do something or to learn more, but sort of at a loss, like how, and just wondering if any other pastors out there are like me in this season. And so, that's really the topic of our conversation for today. And just with your expertise, we'd love for you to just share with us, how is it that you define Christian nationalism?
Yeah, great place to start. So I'm so grateful to be here and grateful to be talking about this topic because I also think the way that we can navigate through is through conversations. And too often we just are afraid to have these conversations. So this is the first step and really grateful for that. So Christian nationalism can be defined as a modern political movement, and that's really important that this is a modern movement, and it is a political movement that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic and political life. It is a cultural framework that is both implicit and explicit, that shapes our perspectives on our American identity, the way we see ourselves as belonging, and it's rooted in social hierarchies. And whenever I talk about what Christian nationalism is, I always want to follow that up with what it's not, because that is almost just as important. That Christian nationalism is not biblical. I know that this is a surprise for there's no mention of the United States of America in the Bible.
I don't know if you're reading the same Bible. I know. I bought one on the internet the other day.
Yeah.
Had everything in there.
Yeah. All about America. Yeah. Also, it's not based on the teachings of Jesus. And it's not historical. And we can talk about that a little bit more. And it's certainly not constitutional. So just some of this baseline, what it is and what it isn't is really important to start the conversation there.
Yeah.
Can you dive into some of those a little bit for us? I went to a screening the other day. Bad Faith is having a bunch of these screenings throughout the United States at this point. And I was invited to this private screening by Simmons College of Kentucky, which is our HBCU here in Louisville. I'm a part of a group called Empower West Louisville, and we have these conversations around race and religion. It's a really fantastic group, and I have no business being in the room, but I'm always grateful to be invited. And they had this screening, and it was about Bad Faith. Have you seen that documentary?
I have, yeah.
What did you think
wonderful.
of it?
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
And it's on point. I think it's important conversations to have.
Yeah. For me, it was just seeing the imagery, the videography, the telling the story, and going back to this historical moment that we're in that was so deeply impactful for me. And being on that campus at a HBCU, it was all kind of put in of we can't have Christian nationalism without mentioning white Christian nationalism.
Absolutely.
And that went together. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. What does it mean to be white Christian nationalism? Is there any difference, or is that the only way?
Yeah, it's very important. I think that, one, there is Christian nationalism that is not particularly white. And we can talk about that as well. And fundamentally, the social hierarchies that are at the core of a Christian nationalist framework and ideology are based on race.
Yeah.
And to really see the way that plays out, we can start with our founding history of this land that became the United States of America. And that always starts with the colonial project and the explorers who came to this land in 1492 and sailed the ocean blue, right? And they came with documents that said that they had the authority, the blessing, to take whatever land they came upon and to treat the people who they encountered, or those who they encountered, however they wanted, because of the doctrine of discovery and this series of papal bulls that came about in the 15th century, and specifically this 1493 papal bull that said that those who they encountered, if they were not Christian and if they were not civilized, then they were not fully human. And therefore, they could be treated in whatever way they wanted. And some listeners might not have heard of the doctrine of discovery, or might have just heard of it in the past 10 years as there's been an increase in racial awareness in the United States. I know I never heard about this growing up and did not hear about the doctrine of discovery until later. But this foundational document and blessing by the church, by the Catholic Church, nonetheless was carried on to Protestant churches, to philosophers, and those founding fathers, this idea that to belong in this place that became the United States, it was expected that you be Christian and civilized, which translated to white European Christian in both the way you looked as well as your cultural practices and worldview. So, and this wasn't just some historical document that was left behind. This document has been called upon even through Supreme Court cases, specifically the Supreme Court case in, I think, 1823, that McIntosh versus Johnson, that used the doctrine of discovery to justify the westward expansion and what we think of as manifest destiny. And this same idea that land could be taken, people could be murdered, their culture could be taken because they weren't Christian, European, aka white, and civilized, aka held the same worldview. That this fundamental assumption is baked into our legal documents that still play out today, as well as our, what I say, our psyches. You know, it's baked into how we see ourselves and how we see others. So, you know, that thread that we can pull through our history in the United States really places this whiteness at the core and Christianity, both identity as well as practices, at the top of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy that we see playing out today.
Wow. So this runs deep. I mean,
it's deep,
almost like from the beginning. I know you had mentioned it, and you first defined sort of Christian nationalism. It's a modern movement. I'm wondering, like ignorant here, of like define what you mean by modern. Of like we can trace this string sort of like all the way back and see how it's played out throughout the history of American, culture, life, politics, religiosity, whatever. But I'm wondering what's the distinction like today with it being modern?
Yeah. So this is where I feel like it gets really complicated, because especially those of us who are wanting to reject some of the like assumptions of Christian nationalism, or wanting to reject the narrative that has been perpetuated that we are a Christian nation from our founding. And we want to argue, no, the founders, the First Amendment says that we have religious freedom, that pluralism and our democracy is built on religious diversity. How can you both say that Christianity was so influential in our founding and also say, no, we aren't a Christian nation, quote unquote, that was built for Christians? Both are true. So there was both a Christian assumption of who was valued, or I guess a value that was rooted in a Christian justification. That's probably a better way to say that.
It's a good distinction there. Yeah.
Yes. So an assumption that was rooted in a Christian justification, while also it has evolved, and this idea has evolved of what it means to be, quote, a Christian nation. So the Christian nationalism that we are seeing today is rooted in that thread of the justification that used religion to justify horrific acts. At the same time, it morphed and took the modern form that it is today in the time period that I would argue started in the 1950s, post-World War II.
Okay.
And a lot of our pastors out there who are listening might be in churches that were built in the 1950s, or every church I've ever worked in had a second, like an education building that was built in the 1950s. If I was in a crowd, I would say, raise your hand if that's you, and everybody raises their hand. We all know the 1950s education wing in a church. And the reason is because there was this real growth in Protestant Christian churches in the United States post-World War II. And this was the time, and specifically during the Eisenhower administration that started in 1952, that we see this faith and country merging in how people in the United States, how Americans came to see themselves and came to merge political systems and political ideologies with an explicitly Christian, and one form of Christianity, I should say, ideals. Now, what's really, I think, interesting to me is that this was led by very moderate mainline Christian movements. So in the 1950s, those who led the effort to, for the first time, include under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, to add in God we trust to our money, to make the national motto for the United States, in God we trust. All of these efforts were done in the Eisenhower administration and were led by Methodists, Presbyterians, Disciples of Christ, the National Council of Churches, a lot of our mainline Protestant Christian institutions led the way in institutionalizing the Christianity that we now think of as merged with God and country.
Wow.
So when I say modern, that's the time frame.
Modern. So I remember it was in the 1950s that, like, in God We Trust showed up on our currency. And I remember learning that in seminary and being like, really? What?
Are you sure, Dr. Bowler?
Are you sure?
We had Dr. K. Bowler for American Christianity.
Nice. Yeah. Oh, she's wonderful.
Yeah. So, you just looking at it from this modern perspective of sort of this, you didn't use the word brand, but of this sort of like wave that we're seeing and living through and experiencing right now of Christian nationalism. Would you say that there's, and so maybe it's even wrong to say the word resurgence or rise, because, what I'm hearing you say is that this is a thread that we can trace back all the way from the beginning. But if we look at sort of in our modern understanding, historically speaking, have we seen a rise, or it seems to be more prevalent to me today, this more ideology that people are more willing to talk about and stand behind and fight for. Is that really the case? Is that just media at work in my life, and why is that, if there has been a rise?
Yeah, both. I think that we are definitely seeing a rise to power and credibility of a more fringe version of Christian nationalism. And that thread, as we take from the 1950s, if we were to pick up that thread of the God and country, that I think so many people also, that's what makes this also really confusing. Sorry, I'm going to take if I had coffee, I would drink it. I'm going to drink some water.
No, you're good.
It's all right.
If we pick up that thread from the 1950s and this God and country that so many feel like, we feel warm fuzzies around that often, right? Like, that's the church that you grew up in with the flag in the front and where you sing, religious hymns for Memorial Day and 4th of July. And our grandparents planted these seeds for many of us in going to their churches. So, but then we take that thread and we see the ways it kind of takes new shapes, right? Yeah. And we move into the 1960s. And what happens in the 1960s? This vast culture change. A lot of things, right? We have civil rights movements. Those warm fuzzies of the 1950s are mostly from white folks who were not experiencing the Jim Crow South and the racist North and the realities of the United States that were much more complicated than apple pie and baseball, right? And so the 1960s raised this cultural awareness through the civil rights movements, the women's rights movements, LGBTQ rights movements started about then, Latino rights movements, as well as the Vietnam War era, the fight against communism, and this is all mixed up in this time that becomes this backlash to the institutions that had kind of kept the status quo for so long. And through the 1960s, there's so much more we could talk about, so I'm going to keep that tight. Then if we look at the 1960s as a little bit of a backlash to the 1950s, then we get the 1970s, which brings the rise of the religious right as we know it today. With Jerry Falwell leading the way at Liberty University, and a backlash from religious organizations and institutions that were more fundamentalist, evangelical institutions. And early on, that backlash was mostly to the desegregation of schools and about race, and losing their tax status because they weren't following the civil rights laws, that this movement starts to take a little different shape. The mainline churches, who had been those who were rooting this God and country, stay a little more moderate, while this more evangelical fundamentalist movement takes the helm of the God and country flag, right? Yeah. And merges with a political movement. And this is where I named that this is very much a political movement that we see today more than a religiously rooted movement. And so when we talk about a rise in Christian nationalism today, we see this kind of beginning with the religious right, but it often stayed fringe, like the most wild elements that were like blatantly, explicitly racist, that, were relegated to like the KKK, right? Right. But then with the rise of the Trump presidency in 2015, 2016, the rhetoric becomes more acceptable to say some of the quiet things out loud, for better or worse. Yeah. Now we know. And at the same time, it opened this Pandora's box that then we see in, what year was Charlottesville, the tiki torches and the
2016, wasn't
2016, 2017.
Yeah. Somewhere in there. I'd say COVID has like created this time blur. I don't know what time anything was for the past 10 years. Yeah. Yeah. It's all together all at once in my mess of a brain. So
yeah. So when we talk about it being modern and the growth and the rise to where today, those who have been tracking what we now are naming really clearly Christian nationalism, which the Public Religion Research Institute has been doing some really great work on studying the number of people who identify with ideas that are aligned with Christian nationalism. And we can see that inching up higher and higher to the point where 10% of the U.S. population is said to be clearly, explicitly aligned with a Christian nationalist ideology that would like to see a full merging of our political systems with a narrow Christian view. But then the even more worrisome is that 20% more are what they call accommodators, to make a whole 30% of the U.S. population who are like a go along with Christian nationalist ideas, that I think is really rooted in a lot of that God and country patriotism, that is this blurry line between God and country patriotism, Christian nationalism, that then can slide into violent, naming that they think violence is justified.
Yeah. That's such a helpful distinction of like what began, in the modern movement in the 50s as like more moderate Christians, maybe just desiring, some cultural prominence or some shared Christian values, right? But also of like this distinction of like, in my mind, there's always a difference between like sort of patriotism and then nationalism, a difference between, I'm grateful for my country and the freedoms I have here. But, it's, as Andy Stanley says in his book on this topic, it's one God, one nation under God. Like it's still God first, not nation first. And so it's helpful for me of like, it seemed motivated by religious values in the 50s, right? Of these shared Christian values. But then in the 70s and 80s, it turned to more of like political motivations, right? Of sort of fighting for maybe this sort of power and this prominence, and what was once extreme and fringe has now become, even more central. That's just so helpful of sort of a distinction of what was sort of like motivating for the people at that time. I'm also like, I have a sense of like, it can be so overwhelming as we talk about this as religious leaders and sort of wade into this history and this conversation, because we've all lived through it in these last, almost 10 years of seeing some of these extremists, tendency to feel the hateful rhetoric that we've seen. Like, words are important, words matter. Words can lead to hate and violence, right? Like, rhetoric is important. We've sort of seen this. And I'm just wondering, talking to two local pastors like Rob and I, what is it that you would like local church leaders to know about this? And maybe what are things that we can be doing to address it in our own communities?
Yeah. So one thing I think is important to hold simultaneously is that we named that 1950s, like, there were these motivations that it was this, thinking that it was faith rooted, but we can't forget the racism aspect of that.
Yes,
and so, that 1950s nostalgia of God and country was for, if you Google those terms, 1950s God and country, see what pictures come up. And listeners, stop and do that right now.
Yeah. Pause.
Yeah, hit pause. What comes up? It's little white kids in classrooms praying to the flag, or saying the Pledge of Allegiance with the flag. It's white families. It's a very white nostalgia. And so as we reflect now, I think that's not meant to further this, like, shame, the white shame loop,
right.
but to have an honest conversation about what is our identity and what does it mean to bring our faith into our politics. And I think that one of the struggles of, that movement that was merging an ideology of our Christian, what kind of Christian, what elements of our Christianity, how does a reflective Christian theology speak to an identity and nostalgia that was very insider, outsider, black, white, and aligned with a particular group. So I think that, one, just remembering that and inviting us to be in conversations about what does our faith say about how we live in the world, which to me, ultimately, that is the question of religion and politics, is what does my faith say about how I want to live personally and communally in this place we call the United States of America, and at the local level and the national level. And so for leaders, and especially local congregations, being able to see and hold that nostalgia, there is an element that is so deeply personal to God and country and how we grew up and the stories that formed us. So how do we learn to hold these two truths? That I was formed by this, and there are elements that still shape who I am today that are really beautiful. And there are really harmful pieces of this history and tradition that we are wrapped up in. And those can both be true. Yeah. And so creating spaces to be able to talk about that, and then to also be asking those questions. What does it look like? To ask the questions about my own faith in a political context.
That's really good.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I think it's so hard for a lot of our church members to engage in that self-reflection without being extremely defensive. And I think that's part of the hardship of a local church pastor is to sit in rooms and tell the story and allow others to tell their story, and then to dive into history and say, well, I get this nostalgic moment for you. Because I'll be honest, for me, when we reflect upon kind of white Protestantism in the 1950s and this resurgence of, hey, can we have that back again, right? It's kind of the request from the religious right. It's so hard for them to understand or even allow themselves without thinking that, oh, this person's coming in to remove all of this from my life as my pastor, right? And I remember I was hosting some conversations. Dr. Jamar Tisby is a professor here at Simmons College of Kentucky, and we did his book, Color of Compromise, as a congregation. And it was like the third session we're going through, and we started with a large group, and that group got smaller and smaller every session because it talked about very uncomfortable things. intentionally. But it was hard to have that discussion. But by the third session, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, why haven't we always been talking about this? Why are we just now engaging in this conversation at our local church?" And part of this is we haven't had those spaces, or maybe, I don't know if pastors haven't been bold enough or dumb enough. I don't know where I am on that scale, to engage in some of these things. But
can I have an opinion?
Yeah. But I wonder, how do we offer those safe places that it can help disarm our own defenses to able to engage in history correctly? I don't know. I don't even want to use the word correctly. I don't know what faithfully. Without saying all of this was wrong, this is all right, or does that question make sense?
Absolutely,
Reverend Doctor.
Because if the church isn't that safe space, then where is it? Yeah. Right? If we can't have these kind of hard conversations about the root of your question, which was which you need to say it again because I want to get it right, of how I want my faith to be lived out in the world, or how my faith sort of impacts how I operate in the world around me.
Which is a beautiful question to dive into, right?
It is, and that's
to
the
reflect
core
upon.
of discipleship. That's the core of me, living in the world and professing to be a Christian, Jesus Christ is Lord. So if I'm not wrestling with politics or social issues, or because they're not issues, it's people, they're my neighbors that Jesus has called me to love, right? If our churches aren't creating these safe places, then what are we doing?
Right.
Mm-hmm. What are we doing?
So there's two elements I think are helpful to pull out in there. I mean, just continual grace and compassion. Grace and compassion, grace and compassion, grace and compassion. And in that, I think separating ourselves, first, when we talk about white Christian nationalism, I put a pin in that Christian nationalism is not only white, that a lot of the studies by Public Religion Research Institute show that there are also Christian nationalist ideas are affirmed in Black communities, and Latino communities, and Asian communities. And that is different than the white Christian nationalism ideology. But to me, it points to this complexity of the ways that our identity as Americans is tied up and mixed up with a religious, and especially a Christian, what we understand as a Christian value set. And so it helps a little to make it, this is about a value set, not about the color of your skin. The color of your skin has shaped your experience. And so how can we help people understand that whiteness is about an experience, not about their core identity? And to me, the next way that I can explore that more thoroughly is to reflect on the complicated nature of my own family. And when you ask people about their own families, you get stories that are full of trauma and beauty and complexity. And, I have alcoholism in my family, and abuse, and poverty, as well as people who have thrived and been educated and had families that have grown. We have all of these things in my family. And when you invite people to reflect on their grandparents or their great-grandparents and ask what they would do differently than their own grandparents, or what did they learn that they have carried on, it helps us see that these complicated multiple truth stories are bound up in our own bodies as much as they are in our communities and in our country. And it takes the blame and shame away at a certain level that becomes more reflective and less feeling like you're attacked or that you are wholly good or wholly bad, because none of us, it turns out, are, I like you're the Holy Roast, are wholly good or wholly bad.
Amen. That's so beautiful. That's so powerful, because what I hear you doing is bringing it down to a local level and community across the table with people that we know and love. We know their name. We may even know part of their story. but there's still a complicated system and family structure that they come from. And I feel like the way that our culture right now is set up of like, it's, we like to sensationalize like sort of the national level, and it's all like either this side or that side. You choose a side, you're mortal enemies now if you're on opposite sides. And we've seen it rip apart local communities, local churches and families, right? Mm-hmm. Families and friend groups. And we are all so much more complicated and nuanced than any of these sort of like one labels.
Right.
Right. Exactly. And that's sort of the approach I've tried in my church of like, we are all so much more than a label. But I love those questions of even bringing it down, even literally closer to home, of sharing story. And what would you do differently? And maybe we can reflect and be nostalgic about our grandparents and still also recognize they were tied up in some different worldviews that we would like to, sort of shed or live differently in the world. So thank you so much. That's beautiful.
I also think it puts the ball in our court too, as individuals in our families, to engage in these conversations. Because I think that is a part of witness. I think the Christian faith, to allow ourselves to engage in and admit where we've gone wrong. Confess. Mm-hmm. I think that's a part of who we are as a Christian faith, and we're kind of scared of it. But if we do it at a localized level, maybe it's a little more disarming to who we are, and we can engage in that faithfully. Because I think some of this is, in order for us to get whatever the other side is of this whole Christian nationalism thing, it forces some people, and should all of us, to be a little bit brave with our families, with our communities, with our neighbors. To call out some things and to engage in ways that are good for the whole, that does reflect my own faith value system, without marching down an American flag and breaking into a building, right? In what ways can I actually affect that? So my question for you is, what ways can or perhaps should religious beliefs influence political decision-making in our democracy? I will say, and I'm just going to name this as Rob. This is Rob, not the Holy Roast. This is not the Kentucky Annual Conference. I think our democracy is under attack. And I think Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, plays a heavy part into that attacking of this cultural moment we find ourselves in. But I don't want to give up on being a Christian. Some days I want to be honest. I don't want to give up on that, but I also want to seek to do good with my own faith. And I do think that it pushes me out into a local, and I think a cultural and a national politic for sure. But I'll be honest, some days I don't know how that should do that in a positive way, because I only see very harmful, negative ways that is seeking to take rights and liberties from others so that others may have power once again for the way that they saw it in their just nostalgic times.
Like power over.
Yeah. So what ways should religious beliefs influence that?
Yeah. I think one of the things I'm most concerned about right now is a purity exclusivist ideology, my way or the highway, you're in or you're out. Yeah. You're not allowed to change or grow or listen. And on, when in critiques of the left, the right has called that cancel culture. In critiques of the right, I would argue that there was an invention of cancel culture that happened in the 1990s, and Christian nationalist ideology is a similar mindset that this is the way it is, and if you're not aligned with it, then you're out. And that is fundamentally in opposition to a pluralist democracy in the United States of America. And so I think all of us have to do a little bit of checking ourselves of our purity, exclusivist ideologies, and be able to actually sit down and listen and be reflective and set down our judgmentalness all around. And one of my concerns with some of the discourse around Christian nationalism from progressives like myself, and I'll wear that label, are that we do kind of repeat some of these us and them tendencies. And so one first important level is to do that self-reflection of, how is my own faith tied up in my own political identity and a national identity and patriotism. So not separating ourselves out or saying this is a problem of the other side. This is a problem of us. And to me, that problem is rooted in hierarchies, rooted in purist, exclusivist ideologies. So the more we can like peel back and say, what is actually going on here? And we want to put a label on it and put a label on other people. And sometimes that's not terribly helpful.
Yeah.
And it is important for us to have those conversations. So, I think so often we've said, oh, we don't talk about politics in church. We don't talk about politics in church. And that has given the conversation to the media, to the loudest voices who are most often seeking power and not the well-being of the community and your neighbors and yourself. So we need to reclaim those conversations and have those deeper conversations. Who are we? Who do we want to be? Without, and maybe make a talking points are off the table. Who do I want to be? Who do I want my community to be? Who do I want my children to be? And when it comes down to it, and I have most all of my family is very conservative. Most all of my family voted for Trump. And my extended family, not my immediate family, just to clarify. just kidding. And they're very loving. It's a deep disconnect for me because some of the labels are very fit, frustrating. Other times, if we can have a real conversation, it actually doesn't go terribly.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does, but most of the time, if we both are actually focused on the well-being of my children, for instance, it's going to come down to actually caring for one another and loving one another.
Yeah.
And so spending more time there and less time repeating national talking points.
Yes.
That's so good.
And grace and compassion, as you said.
Grace
rules
and compassion. Grace and
rules
compassion.
of engagement. Grace and compassion. Grace and compassion. I just really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes when I have hard conversations with folks and we are just open of what we want our end goal to be, we're usually on the same page, health and well-being, and how we get there can be different, but in good open conversations, I think it allows us to see the whole, right? And I think perhaps our 24-hour news cycle on our favorite news media system, and then churches that only think like us, communities and country clubs that only think like us, we create such an insular bubble that we forget about the experience of the other. And I think for myself, pushing myself outside of that bubble, because I know I need it, right, to engage in these sorts of things, that I'm able to learn and to grow and change my perspective through experience. And I'll just... I'm United Methodist because the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, it sounds very nerdy and geeky, but I think the scripture, tradition, reason, experience is a platform and a lens to view the world. And sometimes we forget that there's other things out there, other experiences, other traditions, and we need to engage in that reason together. Because I think the Bible is such a beautiful, holy book. And we have abused it so much and allow it to be an abuse item to other people in the name of Christian nationalism. But I think we need to take a step back and to allow the Holy Spirit to lead and to guide us in these sorts of conversations. So this is that. Thank you. You're challenging me inside of this, and I super appreciate it. Maybe the second way, and I love how we started the conversation around Christian nationalism, and then I'm really interested in politics, and that's just part of my background and who I am and what I want to be. But I find this disconnect between pastors and politics and doing it in healthy ways, as I brought up in our previous question. But what ways should pastors or church leaders or churches in general advocate for policy changes? Should we advocate for policy changes? And if yes, we should, then in what ways is it appropriate? Do you think we should engage in those?
Yeah, great. So one of the things I wrestle with, true confessions, is that
it's a safe place.
There we go. Okay, good. Is that I am not terribly sure if it's possible to separate religion from politics.
Yeah.
And I understand and have advocated for years and years and years on the separation of church and state, and to not have the institutionalization of any one particular ideological sect, right?
Yes.
At the same time, I don't know how to put my faith on a shelf. I can't pull away that core element of who I am that is driven by a call to love. Everything I do, everything I think about, I see, I'm challenged. Not that I actually do it, but that's what drives me, right? And so I think that it's there's one level where it's too much to ask. It doesn't work. And in fact, the entire notion that religion is something particular that we can separate from ourself or our political institutions is a Protestant Christian theory that this is mind blowing, right? For some, was developed in our contemporary times in the United States in the Enlightenment. Before that, that was so beyond. Wait, what? We can't take apart our religion from who we are, our culture, it's tied up. So that being said, as clergy and pastors in the community, I think first and foremost, you're preaching the gospel, which is always political, if we are honest about, because politics is by definition how we live together and how we agree to live together. And if we live in the United States and we say we, the people, we are the government. And so we are bound up in it. The question is, what does that mean? And that is the continual question that, Paul asked from the beginning. What does it look like to love my neighbor? That requires conversation. It requires story sharing. It requires looking at the person in front of you. It's a continual engagement. And so to me, pastors, not shying away from this is political. That doesn't mean partisan. That doesn't mean party. Neither party's getting it right 100% of the time. We do ultimately make decisions on a person who is most aligned with our core values, or a party that is most aligned with our core values, but that's a continual engagement and conversation. So I would encourage local pastors to create spaces for conversations where people can step outside of the binary partisan politics that we have come to understand as politics, and to re-embrace and reclaim politics is how we decide to live together across our multiple ways of seeing the world, seeing God, practicing, not practicing religion. Step in, engage, encourage your congregations to engage.
I love that. And because of it, it's a constant conversation, constant discernment, applying scripture or Christian theology, what we believe, to how we live in the world is that process of Christian ethics, right? Like how we want to operate and live together. And that has political implications, like you're saying. But if it's a constant conversation, to me, I hear you saying that's a constant process of discernment with a local community by the power of the Holy Spirit to inspire, to listen, to share, and to discern together how we as a community might live that out in our local community. And I think, I think there's much diversity in the body of Christ for a reason. That can and should look different in different times and places. And yes, we want to hold the body accountable to when we see harm being done in the name of Christ. And also, I just love how you're drawing it back to how we want to engage and live in the world. And that if we were to actually sit down and talk, we'd probably all have that same goal of human flourishing, right? Of health and well-being. And can we have honest and open conversation about lay our weapons down, lay our power greediness down, and have these conversations about how we can get there together. And I mean that as Christians who are called to love our neighbors as ourselves, right? To engage and use our vote in a way that can love our neighbors as ourselves. I just think, I think you're onto something here.
You should make like a living out of this. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just a
Like,
suggestion.
you should, yeah.
Prayerfully consider it.
Take that into consideration.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Henderson, for being with us today, for just this conversation. I hope that we are modeling and practicing some of this dialogue, right? I was really nervous about this, and am I going to offend? Am I going to say something wrong? I know I'm so ignorant when it comes to some of this, but I also feel very overwhelmed as a local clergy person of how I can help navigate my little herd through this. And so I just appreciate the grace and compassion today, the space you created with us, that hopefully other church leaders that we know who will listen in will say, hey, it's imperfect, but we show up and we do it, right? And we engage and we have some of these hard conversations. So
it's worth it. It's worth it for the whole.
It is worth it. It's worth it for the whole because there is no me. There's only we and the body of Christ, and it's diverse, and we're in it together. So we got to show up. That's it. So we sort of have a fun tradition here at the end of an episode with Holy Roast. I did not prepare you for this, where it's just simply a rapid fire sort of hot seat type. Just a few questions. The first thing that comes to your mind, it's another just super off topic way that our listeners can get to know each of our guests. And so I have just a few questions here for you to answer as we close. So just the first thing that pops to your head, what are you reading right now?
A book, it's called Freedom. I'm trying to remember the tagline. It's about the history of how we understand freedom.
Oh,
I can send you the link to it. I'm terrible at remembering the names.
Please do.
It's a fat book, but it's really good.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. What's one thing on your bucket list that you haven't done yet?
Go to Africa and do see animals and the whole thing.
Yes.
It's on the year I turned 50. I'm saving up.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. What's your favorite city in the U.S. other than the one you live in?
San Diego.
Oh, very good.
I mean, it's just perfect.
What's not to love?
Yeah.
And it is the best weather. I mean, it's just wonderful.
Yeah, and the ocean. And
what is your favorite movie to quote, like just in conversation that you pull from?
I mean, The Princess Bride. I multiple times a day, it seems.
Yes, so applicable. We may or may not have had another guest recently that said the same thing.
That's funny.
Bride.
Yeah.
And then last question, you are a Major League Baseball player and you are called up to bat. What is that pump up, walk up song that you're playing as you walk up?
This sounds lame, but Windows Are Rolled Down by Amos Lee, the version that was recorded live at Red Rocks.
Okay.
Ooh, deep cut. There you go.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to get to know you.
Thank you. So glad to be on. Love what you're doing.
Well, and thank you for the work you're doing. It's so important. And us local pastors need it. We need the help.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.